Clare Daly. You have 10 minutes.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Minister, I think you cut a lonely figure there, surrounded by just one simple government backbencher, not a Labour Party colleague in sight. Maybe they have scurried off to try and find their conscience and public service in this area. Minister, you started today with your latest explanation of your conduct by supposedly clarifying the remarks that you made about the whistleblowers in October of last year when you accused them of not cooperating with the O'Mahony Tribunal. And in your own way you put forward what's being described as an apology, but really it is a bit half-baked, because the reality is, of course, that your comments in October weren't isolated comments. In fact, they were your consistent battle cry during the debate on these issues. Now, in May, when Deputy Collins did indeed welcome the O'Mahony report, you accused us of rejecting all the conclusions contained in that report when you said it was clear to any fair-minded observer that some of the most serious allegations which had been made had no basis in reality. Well, you were wrong, and the Garda Inspectorate said that you were wrong. In March of this year, you told us that you can take your explanation of the situation with Maurice McCabe and the O'Mahony inquiry, you can take that no further, and that there was no basis to the allegation that you misled the House. And here today again, you spend a considerable part of your contribution in trying to cast doubt on a number of the allegations put forward by those Garda whistleblowers, when you make a list and you say that there has been no finding to show that these allegations are correct. I put it to you that you are wrong. Perverting the course of justice, denying the taxpayer revenue from fines that could have been collected is fraud, and it is perverting the court of justice. And there has been no findings to say that these allegations haven't been correct either. You sought to rely in your contribution on remarks made by Bob Olson, where you said that the Garda Inspectorate described the process as a managerial and administrative dysfunction. Well, in actual fact, Professor Dermot Walsh made the point that there's a very thin line between mismanagement and corruption. And as Deputy Wallace said, the Garda Inspectorate, like the Controller and Auditor General, had a very narrow remit. They were not tasked with investigating corruption, and to be honest with you, the quashing of penalty points, he says, is on the scale of corruption. Now, the reality is that the only reason these issues are under public scrutiny is not the fairy tale that we listened to from the Taoiseach earlier, that you're the great Garda reformer. We know that's a lie from your contributions last year. The only reason this is on the agenda is because of the heroic efforts of the whistleblowers, their dogged determination in not letting this issue go against the odds. And at every turn, their efforts were met with belligerence, with being demonised, being denied, vilified, ostracised by members of the force. And really, to be honest with you, it's their courage and their strength that has resulted in the spotlight being put on this issue, to the very great benefit of all the decent Gardaí and all of the citizens in this state. Now, how these whistleblowers were dealt with is important, because it will set the tone for others inside the force and out for the future. And I have to say, I would classify your remarks as really kind of mealy-mouthed, a begrudging recognition of their role, which doesn't in any way ring true with me. I mean, these men really exposed the fact that the solutions which we were told to the problems identified in Án Garda Síochána by the Maurice Tribunal, they exposed that the measures which the state had put in place weren't working, that the mechanisms that we said would lead to a breaking down of the blue wall of silence didn't work. And I think it's very important that their stance is protected. Now, the former confidential recipient, Oliver Connolly, put out a statement where he said that the transcript which was discussed in this House was unlawfully recorded by Maurice McCabe. Now, that's not true, and I think we need to put that on the record in the context that such recordings are often the only security and believable evidence that whistleblowers have, and that source must be protected. And intra-party recordings are entirely different than third-party recordings, and that point has to be said, because everything that the whistleblowers did was lawful. Every single step they took, and yet at every turn they were blocked. When the penalty point issue was announced and became public, what was the first response of the Garda Commissioner? Was it to go and talk to the lads and hear their concerns and see what was wrong? No, it wasn't. It was to put out a press statement to say that there was no question of a culture of termination of penalty points. The very next day, he ordered a notice to go up on the notice board in all Garda stations in order to protect the reputation of Án Garda Síochána, that no members of the Gardaí were to talk to external sources on pain of prosecution. He then went on to call them in, threatened with taking them off pulse. John Wilson's car was searched, other circulars went up. These people were ostracised inside the Garda stations where they worked, and for those reasons, not just the disgusting remark which really verbalised his attitude, Commissioner Callanan, it was entirely appropriate for him to go. Because to me, he epitomised this idea that Án Garda Síochána could be above the law, that they weren't open to challenge, and that their interests were separate to the interests of the public. A system which was highlighted by Justice Smithick, who talked about those who put loyalty to the force above honesty. A system which sees me every day when I drive down Pier Street, a row of cars parked on double yellow lines with not a ticket on them, because everybody knows they're Gardaí's cars, and the civil servants park and pay for parking across the road in the car park. But others believe if you're a guard, you have a perk of the job, the law doesn't apply to you. And that's exactly what the Garda Inspectorate report identified, because a lot of the excuses which Assistant Commissioner Mulmahony said, oh, these were Gardaí on duty, we had an entitlement to write off these penalty points. A lot of the Garda Inspectorate report focused on the fact that you didn't, that just because you're a guard doesn't mean you can use the excuse of speeding to get to work late, as the former Commissioner appeared to have done in his instance. You have to agree with the rules of the road and the procedures that are there. And the interesting thing on the Garda Inspectorate's report for me were two things. Firstly, how accurately Garda Maurice McCabe had got the situation right. His analysis was perfect. And the second thing, I have to be honest, was the analysis we put forward and sent to you and the RSA was pretty much spot on with what the Garda Inspectorate wrote. And that report was complied by a young solicitor, Leah O'Leary. So how come a young solicitor and a Garda sergeant were able to do and expose what 5 superintendents and 6 chief superintendents and 28 staff couldn't do in the Mahoney report? They didn't have a vested interest. They were interested in the truth. That was the difference here. Now, ordinary citizens in this state want a police force that's accountable. We have a Cook inquiry, a Gearan inquiry, now a commission of inquiry into these latest allegations. And the fact that there are illegal recordings which could have resulted in illegal prosecutions have huge ramifications for this state. The fact that one of those tapes will reveal that somebody was fitted up for a serious crime is very worrying, but it's not surprising. We have met people the length and breadth of this state whose lives have been ruined by the fact that their cases were not dealt with appropriately by the Gardaí. Ian Bailey, whose case was described by 5 Supreme Court judges as at the hands of the Gardaí breathtaking, wrongful misbehaviour. Those Gardaí were sent to France to give information about his case. The case of Baiba Salute, a young woman who was shot dead, whose 2 children were left without their mother. Gardaí have brought information to you which says that the cases there was not, the abduction of her children was not properly investigated, which led to that woman losing her life and her solicitor's life being in danger. Cases of racial profiling of the travelling community, which myself and Deputy Wallace raised with you last year, and you are on the record as saying that both deputies are a disgrace. a disgrace for putting on the record of this House the fact that racial profiling occurs. Now, I spent the Sunday before last in Rathkeale, where a 10-year-old boy told me about how their house was broken into and they were held up at gunpoint in an armed robbery, a robbery that the police never investigated because they were travellers. He told me afterwards about how the Gardaí and the Criminal Assets Bureau broke into his house, and he got down on his knees and begged the guards not to shoot his granny and his mammy. And we say that racial profiling doesn't exist in this state. This is what we're talking about. There is systemic problems inside the operation of Án Garda Síochána. Minister, the last point I'll make to you is that the attitude of this government is very like the attitude we encountered when homeowners began to realise that their houses were cracking with pyrite. Cracks emerged, people were in denial. Those who raised the issue and tried to say we have to deal with that were told, don't be talking about that, you'll devalue the estate. Let's cover up the cracks, things will be okay. But you know what? The truth will always out, and in that case, the only way of solving the problem is to remove the contaminated infill and rebuild the house. This Garda Síochána force and the administration of justice cannot be restored with you at the helm. I too will miss you, but your days are numbered.